An 1895 portrait reveals a mystery that baffled historians for decades. Dr. Marcus Wright had spent 15 years studying post-Reconstruction America, specializing in the economic and social lives of formerly enslaved families who attempted to build new futures in the hostile landscape of the late 19th century South. His research had taken him through countless archives, dusty church basements, and private collections across Georgia. Yet nothing had prepared him for what he would find on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in March 2019. The photograph appeared in an online estate auction catalog almost by accident. Wright was searching for documentation related to black landowners in Savannah when the listing caught his attention. Antique family portrait, circa 1895, Savannah origin, unknown subjects. The thumbnail image was small and poorly lit, but something about the composition made him pause. He enlarged the image on his screen and felt his breath catch. 7 people stood in front of a modest wooden house. 6 were black, a middle-aged couple, 3 adult children, and a young woman in her early 20s. The 7th person, standing slightly apart on the left side of the frame, was a white woman of similar age. All were dressed formally, the kind of careful presentation common in photographs of that era when having one's image captured was a significant, expensive event. But it was the young black woman's face that stopped Wright cold. While the others gazed at the camera with varying degrees of composure and dignity, her expression was jarringly different. Her eyes held something he had seen before in his research, not in photographs, but in written testimonies, in letters in the coded language of people who knew they were in mortal danger. It was fear, barely contained beneath a forced smile. Her hands, folded tightly in her lap, were visibly tense, knuckles pale against her dark dress. Wright sat back from his computer screen, his heart beating faster. In 15 years of research, he had learned to recognize when a historical document was trying to tell him something beyond its surface appearance. This photograph was screaming at him. He placed a bid immediately, not knowing yet what story this image contained, but certain, absolutely certain, that it mattered. 3 days later, when the frame arrived at his office at Emory University, Wright carefully removed the backing. There, in faded pencil on the reverse of the photograph, someone had written, "Freeman family, April 1895, Savannah." Nothing more. No first names, no address, no indication of who had taken the photograph or why. Wright photographed the image with high-resolution equipment, then began the painstaking process every historian knows well. The search for context, for names, for the stories that official records so often fail to preserve. He started with census records, property deeds, city directories, and newspaper archives. Within hours, he found his first lead. A property record from 1893 showed that a Samuel Freeman, identified as Colored, had purchased a half-acre plot of land on the outskirts of Savannah for $85, a substantial sum for a black family in that era. Wright felt the familiar excitement of a researcher on the trail of something significant, but then he found something that changed everything. In the Savannah Tribune, a black-owned newspaper, there was a small notice dated May 1895. "The community mourns the unexplained absence of the Freeman family. Prayers are offered." Wright stared at those words. 1 month after the photograph was taken, something had happened. He looked again at the young woman's terrified eyes, and suddenly her expression made terrible sense. She had known. Dr. Wright's investigation began in earnest the following morning. He returned to the census records with renewed focus, cross-referencing the property deed with population data. The 1890 census records for Georgia had been largely destroyed in a fire, but he found fragments in local archives and pieced together the basic structure of the Freeman household. Samuel Freeman, born into slavery around 1845 in South Carolina, appeared in the 1870 census as a freedman working as a carpenter in Savannah. By 1880, he was listed as married to Ruth Freeman, born approximately 1848, occupation listed as seamstress. They had 5 children: Joseph, Thomas, Clara, Benjamin, and Margaret. What struck Wright immediately was Samuel's listing by 1880 as a self-employed carpenter. In the years following Reconstruction, as white supremacist governments systematically stripped away black Americans' gains, self-employment represented both opportunity and vulnerability. It meant Samuel had established his own business, but it also meant he was visible, successful, and potentially threatening to white economic interests. Wright found business advertisements in old newspapers. In the Savannah Morning News from 1888, a small classified ad read, "Quality carpentry and repairs, Freeman and Sons, fair prices." The fact that a black-owned business could advertise in a white newspaper suggested Samuel had built a reputation that transcended racial barriers, at least commercially. Ruth's work as a seamstress appeared equally successful. Wright discovered her name in personal papers of several white Savannah families, preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives. One letter from 1891, written by a white woman to her sister, mentioned that Ruth Freeman made Margaret's wedding dress, and it was the finest work I have seen. But it was the property purchase in 1893 that revealed the true measure of the Freeman family's achievement. Wright obtained the original deed from the Chatham County Records Office. Samuel and Ruth Freeman had paid $85 in cash for a half-acre plot described as fertile bottomland adjacent to the Savannah River. $85 in 1893 represented years of saving and sacrifice. For a black family barely a generation removed from slavery to accumulate that capital and convert it into property ownership was extraordinary. It was exactly the kind of economic independence that terrified white supremacists throughout the South. Wright examined property maps and located the exact parcel. It was prime land, riverside access, fertile soil, close enough to the city for commerce, but far enough for privacy. He found building permits from 1893 showing Samuel had constructed the house himself. This was the house in the photograph, built with his own hands, for his own family, on his own land. The children's records showed similar upward mobility. Joseph appeared as a blacksmith's apprentice, then journeyman. Thomas worked alongside Samuel in carpentry. Benjamin's name appeared in church records as a Sunday school teacher at First African Baptist Church. Clara participated in charity fundraisers, reading poetry at community events. Margaret had attended missionary schools established for black children after the war. But the seventh person in the photograph, the white woman standing slightly apart, presented the deepest mystery. Her presence in a black family's formal portrait in 1895, Georgia, was almost unthinkable. Such mixing was not just socially taboo, it was potentially fatal for everyone involved. Wright expanded his search, looking for any records explaining this anomaly. The woman remained nameless, a ghost whose very presence suggested a story deliberately kept hidden. The notice in the Savannah Tribune dated May 12, 1895, was brief, carefully worded in coded language. The community mourns the unexplained absence of the Freeman family. Prayers are offered for their safe return. Dr. Wright understood that unexplained absence was likely a euphemism. In the 1890s, South, when black families suddenly disappeared, the reasons were rarely mysterious. But he needed evidence, documentation, something beyond inference and historical pattern. He began searching newspaper archives systematically, examining not just black publications, but white newspapers, which often reported violence against black citizens with disturbing casualness, or justified it with racist rhetoric. The Savannah Morning News made no mention of the Freeman family's disappearance. This absence was itself significant. It suggested the family's fate was either unworthy of notice or something powerful. Interests preferred not to publicize. Wright turned to church records. First African Baptist Church, where Benjamin Freeman had taught Sunday school, maintained detailed records. He contacted the church's historical committee and was granted access to their archives. In a ledger book from 1895, he found an entry that made his hands shake. May 19, 1895. Special prayer service held for the Freeman family. Collection taken for the remaining family members. Remaining family members. Someone had survived. Wright's pulse quickened. He read further and found more entries. June 2, 1895. Joseph Freeman departed for Chicago. June 9, 1895. Thomas Freeman and Benjamin Freeman departed for northern cities. Congregation prays for their safety. 3 of the Freeman children had fled north in the weeks following whatever had happened. This was a pattern Wright had seen too often in his research. Families torn apart by violence, survivors scattering across the country, carrying trauma they would rarely speak of openly. He returned to property records, and there he found something that transformed his investigation from academic research into something personal and urgent. On June 30, 1895, the Freeman property was transferred to a white farmer named Robert Chambers. The transaction price, $15. $15 for property purchased 2 years earlier for $85, property that had only increased in value. The transfer document was signed with an X next to the typed name Samuel Freeman, indicating Samuel, a literate man who had signed his own name on the 1893 deed, had allegedly made his mark as an illiterate person would. The document was witnessed by 2 white men, both known associates of the Democratic Party machine that had violently reasserted white supremacist control over Georgia. Wright felt sick. This was fraud. Samuel Freeman had not sold this property willingly. He had either been coerced under threat of violence, or the document had been fabricated after he was already dead. Wright investigated Robert Chambers through city directories. Chambers was listed as a farmer and timber merchant. His name appeared in articles as a member of civic organizations, fronts for white supremacist activity. In one article from 1892, Chambers was quoted, "We must preserve our property from those who would take what is not theirs." The irony was bitter. Chambers accused black Americans of theft while systematically stealing land from families who had legitimately earned and purchased their property. Wright still didn't know exactly what had happened to Samuel, Ruth, Clara, and the white woman. He needed eyewitness accounts, personal testimonies. If 3 Freeman sons had survived and fled north, they might have descendants who had heard stories passed down through generations. Dr. Marcus Wright began tracing Joseph, Thomas, and Benjamin Freeman through census records and genealogical databases. Joseph's trail led to Chicago, where he appeared in the 1900 census as a blacksmith, married with 2 young children. Thomas appeared in Detroit by 1910, working in an automobile factory. Benjamin's trail led to Philadelphia. Using genealogical websites and social media, Wright reached out to anyone with connections to these family lines. He sent carefully worded messages explaining his research and asking if anyone had family stories or documents related to the Freeman family of Savannah. For weeks, he received no responses. Then, on a Friday evening in April, an email arrived from a woman named Patricia Johnson in Chicago. Dr. Wright, I believe you may be researching my great-great-grandfather. His name was Joseph Freeman. My grandmother told me stories about him when I was young. She said something terrible happened to his family in Georgia. I have some of his papers. Would you like to see them? Wright's hands trembled as he typed his response. Yes, he very much wanted to see them. He arrived in Chicago on a gray Monday morning in May 2019. Patricia Johnson lived in the South Side, a neighborhood that had been a destination for black families fleeing the South during the Great Migration. Patricia greeted him warmly, a woman in her early 60s with kind eyes and careful dignity that reminded him of the people in the photograph. After coffee, she led him to her dining room table, where several items lay carefully wrapped in tissue paper. My grandmother was Joseph's daughter, Patricia explained, her voice emotional. Her name was Ruth, named after her grandmother. Before she died, she told me things about the family history. She made me promise to remember to write it down, because too much had already been forgotten. She unwrapped a leather-bound journal, cracked with age, but legible. This was Joseph's. He used it to document what really happened, even though he could never speak of it publicly. Wright's hands trembled as he opened the journal. The first entry was dated June 15, 1895. Arrived in Chicago today. Thomas and Benjamin went to other cities. Safer if we're separated. I have $12. The clothes I'm wearing and the photograph. It's all that's left of everything Papa and Mama built. Wright turned pages carefully. Most entries were brief, documenting Joseph's struggles to find work and establish himself in a city where he knew no one. But scattered throughout were longer passages, fragments of memory, pieces of the story Wright desperately needed to understand. One entry from September 1895 read, "Can't sleep. Keep seeing Clara's face in that photograph." She knew, we all knew, but she understood it most clearly. She tried to tell Papa they should leave, sell the property, go north while they still could. But Papa was proud. He'd worked his whole life, survived slavery, built something with his own hands. He wouldn't let them drive him out. Wright looked up at Patricia. What happened to them? Does he say? Patricia's eyes filled with tears. Keep reading. It's all in there. He wrote it eventually, but it took years. The trauma was too great. Wright found the longest entry, dated April 14th, 1900. Exactly 5 years after the photograph. The entry covered several pages. 5 years ago today, Papa insisted we take the photograph. We'd been receiving threats for months. Notes left on our porch, warnings shouted from passing wagons. Mr. Chambers wanted our land. When Papa refused to sell, the threats became explicit. Papa knew what was coming. He wanted proof that we existed, that we had lived with dignity. And then there was Anne. She appeared at our door one night in January 1895. Terrified, barely coherent. She had nowhere else to go, and she carried a secret that would eventually destroy us all. Dr. Wright read Joseph's words with growing intensity. The journal entry continued. Anne Whitfield came to us because Mama had helped her once before, mending a dress when Anne's father refused to pay for proper clothing. Mama saw the bruises then, but said nothing. What could she say? But that January night, Anne wasn't just running from her father's fists. She was running for her life. The entry explained what Joseph had learned in fragments over the weeks Anne stayed with them. In December 1894, Anne had been working late at the Southeastern Lumber Mill office where her father served as foreman. She had forgotten her shawl and returned after hours to retrieve it. Through the office window, she witnessed something that would haunt her. Robert Chambers and 3 other white men, including her father, standing over the body of a black worker named Isaiah. Joseph wrote, Anne told Clara everything one night when she couldn't stop shaking. She'd seen them arguing with Isaiah about wages. He'd worked for months, and they kept finding excuses not to pay him. When Isaiah threatened to go to the authorities, Chambers shot him, just like that. Then they dragged his body out, and she heard them planning to dump it in the river to say he'd been a drifter who'd moved on. Wright felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just about stolen land anymore. This was about murder, a cover-up, and a witness who could destroy powerful men. The journal continued. Anne hid, terrified they'd seen her. But when she got home, her father was waiting. He'd seen her shadow at the window. He knew she'd witnessed everything. He locked her in her room, beat her, told her if she ever spoke about what she'd seen, he'd kill her himself. But Anne was smarter than he thought. Before he locked her up, she'd taken something from the office. A payroll ledger page showing Isaiah's name, the wages owed to him, proof that he wasn't some vagrant, but a legitimate worker they'd murdered to avoid paying. Wright sat back, his mind racing. Anne hadn't just been fleeing abuse. She'd been fleeing murder charges, threats, and men who would kill to keep their crime hidden, and she'd brought evidence with her. Patricia reached across the table and pulled out another wrapped item. Joseph kept this his whole life. He never knew what to do with it, but he couldn't destroy it either. She unwrapped a brittle yellowed piece of paper, a ledger page from the Southeastern Lumber Mill, dated November 1894. Wright's hands trembled as he examined it. There, in neat handwriting, was a list of workers' names and wages owed. Halfway down the page, Isaiah Porter, colored $47.50, owed for timber work, October-November 1894. Wright photographed the ledger page carefully, his mind working through the implications. This document proved that Isaiah Porter was not a transient, but an employee with documented wages. More importantly, it provided a motive for why Chambers and his associates would want to eliminate anyone who knew about his murder, including the Freeman family who had harbored the witness. He returned to Joseph's journal, searching for more details about Anne's time with the family. An entry from February 1895 provided crucial context. Anne helps Mama with sewing work. She's skilled with her hands, and Mama says she's good company. Clara and Margaret treat her like a sister. Papa worries constantly about the danger of keeping her here, but Mama insists we can't turn her away. She has nowhere else, Mama says. They'll kill her if they find her. Another entry from March. Today, a man came to the house asking about Anne. Said he was her uncle, looking for his missing niece. Papa told him we hadn't seen any white girls around here. After he left, Anne was shaking so hard she couldn't stand. That wasn't my uncle, she said. That was one of Chambers' men. They're looking for her. They know she saw something. Wright felt the pieces falling into place. The Freeman family hadn't just been targeted because of their land. They'd been targeted because they were protecting a witness to murder. The photograph took on new meaning now. Samuel Freeman had insisted on including Anne, not just as an act of defiance against segregation, but as documentation. If something happened to them, this photograph would prove Anne had been under their protection, would raise questions about why a white woman was living with a black family. Wright turned to Patricia. Did Joseph ever try to use this ledger page? Did he ever go to authorities about Isaiah Porter's murder? Patricia shook her head sadly. By the time Joseph felt safe enough to even consider it, years had passed. Isaiah's body was never found. Chambers had made sure of that. Without a body, without witnesses willing to testify, what case could there be? And Joseph would have to admit he'd harbored Anne, which might have brought more danger to him and his brothers. Wright understood the impossible position Joseph had been in. The same system that had allowed Chambers to steal the Freeman land and murder Samuel and Ruth with impunity would never have brought justice for Isaiah Porter. The ledger page was evidence of a crime that the authorities had no interest in prosecuting. He asked the question that had been troubling him since he'd first seen the photograph. What happened to Anne that night? Joseph's first journal entry mentioned finding her body. Patricia's expression grew even more pained. Yes, Joseph wrote about it later, when he could finally face the memory. Anne died trying to protect Clara and Margaret. When the men came, she told them she'd go with them willingly if they'd leave the family alone. She thought maybe her being white would give her some leverage, some protection. She was wrong. Wright found the entry Patricia had referenced, dated December 1905, 10 years after the massacre. Joseph's handwriting was shaky, the words sometimes difficult to decipher. I need to write what I saw that night. I've carried it alone for 10 years, and it's killing me from the inside. Maybe if I write it down, I can finally sleep without seeing their faces. The entry described the evening of May 8, 1895, in excruciating detail. The Freeman family had been on edge for days. More threatening notes had appeared. More men had ridden past their property slowly, deliberately, making their presence known. Samuel had sent word to other families in the black community, warning them to stay away from the Freeman house for their own safety. That evening, Papa gathered us together, Joseph wrote. He told us that if men came that night, we boys were to run immediately. No arguments, no heroics. He said our job was to survive, to carry forward the story of what we'd built, to make sure we weren't erased from history. He made us promise. Thomas and Benjamin agreed right away, but I hesitated. Papa grabbed my shoulders and looked me in the eyes. You run, he said. You live. That's how you honor us. Not by dying beside us, but by living after us. The men came just after midnight, 7 of them on horseback, carrying torches and weapons. Joseph, Thomas, and Benjamin escaped through the back of the house as planned, hiding in the woods behind the property. From there, concealed in darkness, they witnessed everything. We heard Anne's voice first, Joseph wrote. She walked out onto the porch, hands raised, and called out to them. I'm Anne Whitfield, she said. James Whitfield's daughter. I'll come with you. Just leave this family alone. They didn't do anything wrong. They were just helping me. Chambers laughed. It was a terrible sound. You think we came just for you, girl? You think this is just about you running your mouth? Then he said something that made my blood freeze. This is about us thinking they can own good land, about them thinking they're equal to white men, about them harboring our property. Both the girl and the land belong to us. The journal described how Samuel had stepped out beside Anne, Ruth close behind him. Samuel tried to negotiate, tried to appeal to law and reason. He showed them the property deed, argued that he'd purchased the land legally, that they had no right to it. Chambers tore the deed from his hands and lit it on fire with one of the torches. What happened next was methodical and brutal. They forced the family to watch as they burned the house. Clara and Margaret were still inside, along with Anne, when the flames began. Wright had to stop reading several times, the descriptions too painful to process quickly. Joseph's journal entry continued with details that Wright knew would never leave him. When Clara and Margaret tried to run from the burning house, they were caught. Anne had tried to shield them, placing herself between the young women and the men. The last thing Joseph saw before his brothers pulled him deeper into the woods was Anne falling to the ground, beaten. "We stayed hidden until dawn," Joseph wrote. "The longest night of my life. We heard screams, we heard laughter. We smelled smoke and worse things. When the sun finally rose, they were gone. We came out of the woods like ghosts, barely able to walk, barely able to breathe. The house was ash. Papa was hanging from the oak tree he'd planted himself. Mama was on the ground beneath him. They'd shot her when she tried to cut him down." The entry described finding Anne's body near the remains of the house, beaten beyond recognition, but Clara and Margaret were nowhere to be found. Joseph and his brothers searched desperately, calling their sisters' names in hoarse whispers, terrified the men might return. "We found drag marks leading away from the house toward the river," Joseph wrote. "Thomas wanted to follow them, but Benjamin stopped him. 'They're gone,' he said. 'If they were alive, they'd have answered us by now.' We didn't want to believe it, but we knew he was right. We buried Papa, Mama, and Anne in shallow graves. It was all we could manage. We said prayers over them. Then we ran." Wright looked up from the journal, his eyes burning. Patricia was crying silently. "They never knew for certain what happened to Clara and Margaret." Patricia shook her head. Joseph spent the rest of his life wondering. Every time he saw a black woman who looked like his sisters, his heart would stop. He made inquiries through churches, through the few people he trusted. Nothing. They simply vanished that night. Wright felt the weight of that uncertainty, the special torture of not knowing. At least with Samuel, Ruth, and Anne, there had been bodies, burials, some form of closure, however terrible. But Clara and Margaret existed in a liminal space between life and death, their fates unknown. He returned to the journal, finding a later entry from 1920. "I received a letter today from a pastor in Alabama. He'd heard I was looking for information about 2 young women who disappeared from Georgia in 1895. He said that around that time, his church had helped several women escape from a situation he described as forced labor. He couldn't give me names. It had been 25 years, and the records were deliberately vague to protect the women. But he said 2 of them had eventually made their way to Philadelphia. Could it have been Clara and Margaret? I want to believe it so badly it physically hurts, but I'll probably never know for certain. Dr. Wright spent the next 3 months following every lead suggested by Joseph's journal. He searched records in Alabama and Philadelphia for any trace of Clara and Margaret Freeman. He found dozens of women with those names, but none whose ages and origins matched. The trail was cold after 130 years. He turned his attention to Isaiah Porter, the murdered worker whose death had set everything in motion. Using the ledger page as a starting point, Wright searched for any records of Porter in Savannah before December 1894. He found census records showing Isaiah Porter, a 34-year-old black man, living in a boarding house for unmarried workers. He had been born in slavery in South Carolina, freed during the war, and had worked various manual labor jobs across the South. Wright discovered something else in the Savannah Tribune archives, a small notice from January 1895. Community members expressed concern regarding the whereabouts of Isaiah Porter, employed at Southeastern Lumber Mill, who has not been seen since early December. Family in Charleston asks for any information. So Isaiah had family who had looked for him, who had known something was wrong. Wright tracked down descendants in Charleston and spoke with a great-grandson of Isaiah's brother. The family had never learned what happened to Isaiah. He had simply vanished. Another black man disappeared into the machinery of violence and exploitation that defined that era. Wright then investigated Robert Chambers more thoroughly. Property records showed that Chambers had indeed acquired the Freeman land in June 1895 through the fraudulent transfer. He'd sold it 2 years later for $200, more than twice what Samuel had originally paid, profiting handsomely from theft and murder. Chambers had lived until 1923, dying as a respected member of Savannah society. His obituary in the Savannah Morning News described him as a successful farmer and businessman, who had contributed greatly to the economic development of the region. There was no mention of the lives he'd destroyed, the people he'd murdered, the land he'd stolen. Wright found James Whitfield's records as well. Ann's father had continued working at the lumber mill until 1901, when he'd been fired for chronic drunkenness. He'd died 2 years later. Had he been haunted by his daughter's death? Had he felt any remorse for the role he'd played? The records offered no answers. The photograph itself became a subject of Wright's investigation. He consulted with photography historians to understand the context of its creation. In 1895, having a formal portrait taken was expensive and required significant planning. The photographer would have had to transport equipment to the Freeman property, set up the shot, and process the image. This wasn't a casual snapshot. It was a deliberate, formal documentation. One photography expert Wright consulted noted something interesting. The composition is unusual. Typically, families would be arranged more tightly together, with clear hierarchies of importance. But in this image, everyone is given roughly equal prominence. And the inclusion of the white woman, standing slightly apart but clearly part of the group, that's extraordinary. This photograph was making a statement. In August 2019, Dr. Wright published his findings in the Journal of Southern History. The article, titled "The Freeman Family and the Hidden History of Post-Reconstruction Violence," laid out everything he had discovered: the family's achievements, the property theft, the murders, Ann's testimony, and Isaiah Porter's forgotten death. He included high-resolution images of the photograph, the ledger page, and Joseph's journal entries. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Descendants of other black families who had lost land in similar circumstances reached out, sharing their own stories. Legal historians began examining whether any of these historical land thefts could be legally challenged. The case of the Freeman family became a touchstone for broader discussions about reparations and historical justice. Wright also heard from unexpected sources. A woman in Oregon contacted him, claiming to be the great-great-granddaughter of Margaret Freeman. She said her grandmother had told stories about surviving a massacre in Georgia as a young woman, fleeing north and changing her name to protect herself. The woman had documents, a Bible with Margaret F. inscribed inside, dated 1892, and a letter written in 1940 that referenced "the family I lost in Savannah." Wright traveled to Oregon to examine the evidence. The handwriting in the letter matched samples he'd found of Margaret's writing in church records. DNA testing of the woman and Patricia Johnson in Chicago showed they were indeed related. Margaret had survived. She had made it north, had lived a long life under a different name, had married and had children. She had never returned to Georgia, had never tried to contact her brothers. The fear and trauma had been too great. Clara's fate remained unknown. Margaret's letter from 1940 mentioned, "My beloved sister, who did not survive that terrible night," but provided no details. Whether Clara had died in the fire, been killed by Chambers and his men, or met some other end, no one would ever know with certainty. The Freeman property itself had changed hands many times over the decades. By 2019, it was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, owned by a development company planning luxury condominiums. Wright contacted Patricia Johnson and Margaret's descendants with an idea. What if they challenged the ownership, argued that the original 1895 transfer was fraudulent, and sought to reclaim the land? The legal battle that followed attracted national attention. And while the courts ultimately ruled that too much time had passed for the property to be returned, the publicity forced the development company to negotiate. They agreed to set aside a portion of the land as a memorial park to be named the Freeman Porter Memorial Garden, honoring both the family and Isaiah Porter. On April 14th, 2021, 126 years to the day after the photograph was taken, the memorial was dedicated. Descendants of Joseph, Benjamin, and Margaret attended, along with descendants of Isaiah Porter's family. The ceremony included a granite monument engraved with the names of Samuel, Ruth, Clara, Margaret, and Anne, along with Isaiah Porter. Beneath the names, an inscription read, "Their land was stolen, their lives were taken, their story was silenced, but they are not forgotten." Wright gave a speech at the dedication, holding a large reproduction of the 1895 photograph. "This image," he said, "was meant to be evidence of a family's existence, their dignity, their right to their own land and their own lives. Samuel Freeman knew he was in danger when he had this photograph taken. He knew he might not survive, but he wanted proof that he and his family had lived, had built something, had mattered. For 130 years, this photograph kept that evidence alive. Now, finally, their story has been told. Now, finally, they are remembered not as victims, not as statistics in the history of racial violence, but as people, as a family who built something beautiful and refused to be erased." Patricia Johnson stood beside Wright, holding the original photograph in its frame. She looked at the faces of her ancestors, at Joseph's serious expression, at Ruth's quiet strength, at Samuel's dignity, at Clara's haunted eyes that had tried to warn them all. She thought about Anne, who had died protecting people who owed her nothing. She thought about Isaiah Porter, murdered for demanding wages he'd earned. And she thought about Joseph, who had carried the burden of survival for 50 years, who had written it all down so it wouldn't be lost. The photograph had done its work. Samuel Freeman's final act of resistance had succeeded. They had not been erased. Their story had been told. And in the faces of their descendants, standing in the garden on the land that had once been stolen from them, something of what Samuel and Ruth had built lived on. Wright returned to his office at Emory University the following week, but he couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. How many others like it existed, he wondered. How many old images held secrets, waiting for someone to notice, to investigate, to care enough to uncover the truth? The Freeman photograph had been one lucky discovery. How many other families' stories remained hidden, their evidence gathering dust in estate sales and forgotten archives? He thought about Clara, whose fate remained unknown. He thought about the countless other Black Americans who had disappeared into the violence of that era, whose names were never recorded, whose deaths were never investigated. The Freeman family had been fortunate, if such a word could be used. Their story had survived in Joseph's journal, in the photograph, in the memories passed down through generations. So many others had been completely erased, but the photograph remained a testament to resistance, to dignity, to the refusal to be forgotten. 7 people standing in front of a wooden house in April 1895, dressed in their finest clothes, staring into the camera lens and into history. They could not have known that their image would survive long after the house was burned, long after they themselves were gone. They could not have known that more than a century later, people would gather to honor their memory, to speak their names, to acknowledge what had been done to them and what they had built despite everything. The photograph had become more than documentation. It had become a bridge between past and present, between injustice and acknowledgement, between silence and truth. And in Dr. Marcus Wright's office, pinned to his wall where he could see it every day, the Freeman family looked out from 1895, their story finally told, their existence finally recognized, their dignity finally restored.